Thanks so much, Jake. Yeah, it really is my pleasure to introduce Courtney today. Courtney is one of the most prominent researchers at Utah State and has done probably more work related to public lands and the management of Utah's natural landscapes than most faculty around the Intermountain West. So we're really great that she can. We're really gracious that she can be here to present to us today. One of the projects that Courtney is leading up that she's going to be speaking about today is the Utah Wellbeing Survey. And we've specifically asked her to pull out some information from that survey effort that's going out to communities across Utah, both gateway communities and non-gateway communities, and highlight some of the unique differences that have been seen in gateway communities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Courtney Flint, Professor of Sociology here at Utah State University.
Let's see. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jordan. It's really great to be with you. I just think this initiative is so interesting and so important. You know, these gateway and natural amenity communities are part of my life as sort of the places that I grew up in, and continue to really be a high priority for me. I think our communities in this area are changing rapidly, and really need to pull together. I love this idea of pulling together sort of the practice and the research to help support decision-making in these communities. So I'm happy to be here. As Jordan said, I'm a natural resource sociology professor at Utah State University, also part of Extension as a community resource specialist. So, you know, if we think about well-being, you know, this concept of well-being goes back, you know, thousands of years really to the ancient Greeks. It was Aristotle that really focused a lot of thought on what goes into living a good life. And essentially that's the definition that I work with of well-being. It's that everything that goes into making a good life, but it's going to be something that varies a great deal from one person to the next. We find that there's no one standard definition that's accepted out there. And so it becomes a very interesting inquiry, but something that I think a lot of people have just sort of a core level affinity for. Thinking about, oops, I got to back up on. Thinking about gateway and natural amenity communities, you know, I think these are communities where particular aspects of well-being are really, you know, highlighted. They're at the forefront of our thought and actions in these communities, and that's that proximity to the natural world and natural spaces as something that perhaps frames some of the activities around these communities, and perhaps what draws people in, gives us a certain set of maybe expectations or hypotheses about what we might find when we talk to people about well-being. And so keep that in mind as we go through as to whether or not the data sort of supports that or not. We could talk about it. So I'll present from here on some of the data, the methods and the data that we've found, again, separating the gateway communities from the others in our study. And I certainly, if you'd like to ask something to clarify as I go, that's just fine with me, but I'll certainly try to speed along so that there's time for question and answers before you guys go on to your community perspectives. So thank you. Let's see. So the Utah Wellbeing Project is really designed to combine inquiry on the perspectives of well-being, the experience of well-being from community residents in the cities of Utah, with a look at community indicators, secondary indicators that are available, that we measure certain aspects of well-being, and to see how they speak to each other. I won't be talking at all about the indicators portion of this project, but something that will be continuing to unfold in future years. But what I will be talking about are some recent surveys, but we've been doing survey work before 2020. So this project got started actually in 2018 with some pilot work in Logan and Salt Lake in Utah. 2019, we did public intercept surveys with iPads in the green survey, in the green communities, green and orange ones on this map. And then in 2020, we added another bunch of cities to the list, and the idea is to work in partnership with cities so that I design the survey and carry it out, but the cities lead the advertising and the recruitment. So we went from public intercept interviews in 19 to online surveys in, using Qualtrics, but advertised via social media, webinars, websites, newsletters, word of mouth, and things like that. We had in 2020 over 4,000 completed surveys returned over 18 cities. Each of these cities has a report that's on this website that's listed here as this extension website. I'm working now on a statewide report. I think I'll also try to put together this GNAR presentation as a separate report as well. We'll be glad to share that. But the data are just fairly hot off the press, and we're just trying to crank out the findings in a number of different formats. All right, so one thing that's I think is really important to note is that when we use these methods, it's really kind of hard to control just how many responses you're going to get. So we have some communities that really got the word out, like Eagle Mountain, where we have over 500 responses and with a fairly low margin of error. And this is looking at the most conservative way of calculating that. But other communities, you can see when we get down to, especially like to Nibley up in Cache Valley, Utah, where we didn't get much great response at all. And the margin of error is quite high. And I want you to keep that in mind as you look at the findings. These are just those communities that fall on this big spreadsheet of cities that in Utah that sort of fit the gateway sort of criteria. And I'm not quite sure what those criteria are, but I went through that list and 8 of those cities were ones that we'd included in our survey. So I'm gonna present information on these communities separate from the other 10 communities that we surveyed. And we also look carefully at the demographics of the respondents, ask a lot of demographic questions and try to be real transparent about who we're hearing from, and then thus in comparison with census data, who we're not hearing from. And that information is in the city reports. Oops, I'll back up one. So, one of the things we're asking is just, how is your overall personal well-being for the respondents? And you can see how tightly stacked the responses are here if you look at a 1 to 5 scale from very poor to excellent. And so really very little difference, statistically significant difference across communities. Tooele does stand out as statistically different from some of the others, but there's not much difference in the rest of that stack, actually. But it depends on how you look at the data, and I think this is important for all of us that work with data, that the way it's visualized, the way it's presented can tell very different stories with the very same data. So if we look at spreading out these communities from their low end to the high end, you really start to see the differences across these communities. But I can tell you that there's no significant difference between those gateway communities that are the set on the top in green and the ones that are not gateway communities or don't fit that criteria that are along the bottom. So despite what looks like some differences across these different cities, those really, they're not different, the different categories, NAR to non-NAR. But you can see that they do hover above and below an average of just over a 4.0 on a 1 to 5 scale here. We can also look at this by breaking down the full scale and the Likert data. And so it allows you to see that for those NAR communities, 75% at least or more of the respondents in these gateway communities said that their well-being, overall personal well-being, was a 4 or a 5 on a 5-point scale. That's awesome. I mean, that's really great. That suggests that we have the vast majority of residents of these cities, or the respondents at least, saying that they're doing quite well. It does, however, illuminate that we've got anywhere from 16 to 25% of respondents that say that, their well-being might, not be so great. That label is not quite right, but it's from not at all good, essentially, or very poor to excellent. Actually, the scale's wrong on that. My apologies. But anyway, you can see that these data vary, but the difference between the NAR, the gateway communities and the non-gateway communities is really not at all significant. There's really quite a lot of overlap there. Now, the other thing we do with this survey is to break well-being down into a number of different domains, and we typically have 10. Moab asked us to add an 11th category, and that's income. For all of the others, that's sort of subsumed within living standards, but we added the 11th. And we ask folks to not only say, how is your well-being in these 10 different domains, but also how important is that domain to your well-being? And that allows us to give this matrix approach, this quadrant approach here to presenting the data. And what I try to draw people's attention to is this lower right quadrant, this red zone on the bottom. These are the kinds of domains that folks have rated as a little bit lower than average, but they're high in importance. Suggest this might be what we call an action arena, where there's maybe some attention could be placed by municipal leaders to addressing some of these things. So these are the data here for Moab, from the Moab survey. And you can see here that connection with nature is rated the highest of these 10 domains. Mental health and physical health were the most important of these domains. And local environmental quality and living standards fall in this action arena where they aren't rated very high, but they're very important to the respondents. But we can look across different communities and see that this matrix shifts. It doesn't look the same in every place. So here we have Richfield, and we see quite a different structure within these domains. So we have mental health popping up in this action arena for Richfield, safety and security being both the highest rated and the most important. And you can see how the various things compare here. Of course, most of these things are quite high in terms of both rating and importance. You can see that in that upper graph where it shows these things cluster fairly tightly together. So again, how the data are presented makes a big difference. And so you need to keep that in mind. They're all above a 3 here on the that are near a 3 on rating and above a 3 on importance, but we can look at how they relate to each other. Let's see here, just moving along. You can see here when we throw up other communities, Eagle Mountain and Laverkin, these are 2 communities that didn't have anything in that red zone, that action arena, but the relative relationship among these domains does vary quite substantially, with connection to nature being very high, rated high in Laverkin, but rated lower than average in Eagle Mountain. So lots of data here. I'll move on, but that's one of the things that we're looking at. You know, we're also looking at the role that the demographics play. So here's just the findings from a multivariate analysis of looking at Moab and looking at these well-being domains, taking into consideration some of the demographic characteristics. And you can see that in rating the domains, gender plays a difference in how these things are rated. Actually, wait, these is importance. I should back up one. So these are the ratings of the different well-being domains, and age comes up as quite significant. College degree or education, higher income being more, rating things higher than others for a few of these cases. But when we shift to the importance of the domain, age doesn't matter too much, except for that local environmental quality, where the folks who are 60 plus are higher than those that are 18 to 39. Otherwise, age is not important on importance, but gender becomes something of importance, as does religion here in Moab, where those that might be from the Latter-day Saint community are significantly, a few of these domains are less important than some of the other religious folks with different religious identities. So we take into account some of these demographics. Just a couple more things to share. We look at community action. To what degree do people take action together in response to local problems and opportunities? The gateway communities are a little bit significantly higher than the non-gateway communities, but not by much. So you can see there is variation though. Folks in Moab, Nibley, Richfield, a little more likely to say people take action than perhaps in a place like Eagle Mountain or Laverkin, but not a whole lot of difference. We also ask people, to what degree do you feel connected to your community? And again, those gateway community folks were a little bit higher than the non-gateway community folks. But again, it varies substantially from one community to the next, as you can see across these scales here, with folks in Nibley and Moab and Richfield, again, feeling a little bit more connected to their community than perhaps folks in Hurricane Eagle Mountain and La Verkin. May have something to do with some of the demographics of those communities, their rapid growth and changes, and people, newcomers coming in. All right, so we also ask some questions about how do people feel about population growth? What's the rate of population growth like for you, and what's the pace of economic growth? We see very different responses. We get a lot of folks in both categories saying that the population growth is too fast, but not so much in La Verkin and Richfield, where most folks are saying it's actually just right. Whereas in terms of economic growth, you know, from Hurricane to Richfield, you're seeing quite a few people say this economic growth is too slow, we could use more. But a place like Moab is saying it's actually too fast. And we know from the qualitative comments and responses that they're feeling like that's the tourism industry and that economic component that is really taken off pretty quickly. Just one more area of data here for you. We look at the influence of landscape features on well-being. You can see the overwhelming positive responses to natural things like rivers and mountains, lakes. We have trails and city parks, red rocks and farmland. But then some of those more human landscapes, you get a few more negative responses, but these vary quite a bit from community to community. And the NAR group really is a little different here. Non-gateway communities, particularly when it comes to city parks, they're a little bit, I think they're a little less positive. Same with, but very positive on red rocks and farmland. Interestingly enough, the gateway community folks were a bit more positive about the role of residential development, manufacturing industries, and extractive industries than folks from those non-gateway communities. I think this has a lot to do with rural economies and folks really looking towards anything that they can get their hands on to improve economic situations in some of the rural spaces. So just to wrap it up here, I know I've taken up quite a bit of your time, but you know, I want to, you know, it's a limited data set. There's only 8 of these gateway communities, and some of them are probably not what some of you think of as gateway communities, some more than others. But we really welcome more cities into the study. We'll be continuing to do these kinds of surveys across Utah, but I also would welcome any interest from folks that are outside of Utah. There's definitely our capacity to do these surveys throughout the West. It'd be very interesting to start to be able to build a set of communities to compare. So let me know if you'd be interested in having me work with your city to gather these kind of data. The other thing is most of these data come from late January and February. This is right before COVID-19 hit us. And so as we know, new factors have come in and hit folks in terms of well-being quite hard, in terms of health and economics. So it's going to be important to look at change in these things over time, and that can be, I think, helpful in the planning process. And that's the point here, is to put these kinds of data into the hands of local decision makers and the planners that are working on plans for their community's future. I think these data show that there's considerable variation among the gateway communities, and we should watch our assumptions that they're fundamentally different from other types of communities, not necessarily say these data, but also that the gateway communities have different attitudinal and sort of well-being profiles. And I think that's important to getting our hands on what's going on in these communities. A one size may not fit all when it comes to thinking about the well-being and planning for the well-being of these places. So with that, I will just share again the website where you can find the city reports, and the summary statewide reports we'll be putting on there as well. And I welcome any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And we'll make sure we get this link posted up on the NAR website as well. So everybody who is on the presentation today can get access to it, and those that aren't will still have access to it as well. We do have time for questions for Courtney. If you want to go ahead and chat and type those into the chat box, there's a chat button at the bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and type those questions in now, and Courtney to address them. Courtney, maybe while those start to come in, I'll go ahead and kind of kick us off with an initial question. for most of your respondents, are they individual residents within these communities? And maybe from some of your discussions with these different communities, have you seen, or can you speak to any differences between the residents who have lived in these communities and community leaders? Do they have different motivations and different preferences for, for what they want to see their communities become?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So yeah, 97 to 99% of the respondents are full-time residents, with just a few handful of part-time residents. So that's a really important point, is that especially in these gateway and natural amenity communities, there's a lot of part-time residents, and this survey really doesn't speak to those folks. I think maybe whether it's the time of year or just how it was delivered, these are really full-time residents of these communities. Very important distinction when it comes to these gateway communities. I've spoken to the city leaders in all of these cities, and when we go over the findings, some things they nod their head and they don't surprise them at all. They hear these things on a daily basis, but other things sometimes come up as a surprise. And I think that sometimes they have some assumptions about either the demographics or the attitudes of folks, and the data we can query the data and kind of investigate those things. One of the communities, I remember a conversation where they thought it was really the newcomers that didn't really want to see population growth go up anymore. They wanted to kind of pull that gangplank in. They wanted to, they wanted in, but they wanted to shut the gate behind them. That was the perception. But actually, when we got into the data, it was actually across the board, and mixed. Most of the 75% were saying, or more saying, this is too fast. And those were the old timers as well as the newcomers, it just varies. So sometimes we can challenge the assumptions that some leaders have, and these data can start to help to answer some of those questions. Just one example, but yeah, there are some cases where the assumptions are not being met, but on the other hand, we see a lot of cases where the leaders really do have their finger on the pulse of these community dynamics. The qualitative data in the comments also really help us to shed some light on some local issues, and lots of qualitative responses, 30 to 40% of respondents giving really rich comments, which is unusual in a survey.
Thanks, Courtney. A question from Jim Shank, who's with Legends of Superior Trails down in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And he's asking specifically about questions that you might include in subsequent versions of the survey, subsequent waves of the survey that go out after COVID, to trying to gauge any changes that might have happened as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, and we did also just finish up a survey of leaders in response to COVID, and asking them what kind of impacts they thought would be the most profound in their communities. And I think those kinds of questions are important to ask residents too. What are the impacts? Are they social impacts? Are they health impacts? Are they economic impacts? And then get those broken down, and where they'd like to see, where they feel that they need more services or more help, that might help the city leaders and county and other folks to actually direct resources where they might be needed. So some of those questions we can certainly add into the surveys. We also have allowed every city the chance to ask their own specific questions. So Nephi, Bountiful, Moab, all asked very community specific types of questions, and there's always space to do that as well. So if we want to keep plenty of things the same across the city so we can compare, but there's always space for those kinds of questions that really help city leaders. So I would work with the city folks to develop questionnaires that really suit their needs. There's a couple other questions up there about plans to expand the survey to other communities not included. Absolutely, would love to build this and incorporate more cities. There's really no cost to doing so, as long as the cities are willing to take on the advertising and the recruitment for the survey effort. We'll continue to use an online method unless someone plants a money tree and we get enough money to do other modes, but that's the plan. Yeah.
Thanks, Courtney. The last question that we have up is from Danya, and this is a question that's been a little bit recurring in some of the listening sessions that we've seen before, and your data kind of really bring it to light. You really showed that there was, at least between the NAR communities and non-NAR communities, not a lot of differences. Do you think that that might speak to the fact that there's not just the gateway communities aren't all the same, that there really are distinct types of gateway communities, and some of that variability in their preferences and their perceptions might be kind of watering down some of those distinct differences. And I think you really highlighted that when you pulled up some of the graphs from like Moab, and you saw some distinct trends there compared to other gateway communities. So maybe you can speak to this possibility for each development trajectory for gateway communities being pretty distinct, and how that might affect their perceptions of well-being.
Yeah, I think we have some findings that we're seeing is quite generalizable across communities, whether they're gateway or non-gateway, and then other things that are very context specific. And I don't think we have enough data yet to understand. You know, we don't have enough to generate like a typology of different types of communities, but we do have enough data to say there are differences here for sure, especially as we look into these matrices and we see these different portfolios of domains that are obviously very, very important to folks or in need of attention. These vary from one place to another. And so I think it just shows us that we really need to be mindful that there is going to be a lot of variation, different types of gateway communities, and we just need a lot more data to be able to try to come up with a typology of maybe there are certain types, and not necessarily every community is entirely, obviously every community has its own circumstances and experiences and is unique in many ways, but there might be clusters of communities within the gateway community sort of portfolio that they could learn from each other, right? And putting those types of communities in touch with each other to share experiences, making sure that we're kind of comparing apples and apples, I think it's going to be important in that planning process.
Thanks, Courtney. Kevin Walker from Grand County is asking about the specific geographic location of respondents, and whether there's any way to compare those who live like downtown versus those who live outside, either outside of a city center,
Yep.
or outside of the actual city itself in the broader community or county.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to share something else with you real quick. This is the Moab Report. And so basically we rely on the cities to tell us how we should, what kind of question we should ask to geolocate folks. We don't get their specific location, but we can ask them. So for the Moab survey, we asked them to let us know if they lived in Moab City, Spanish Valley, Castle Valley, or elsewhere in the county. But in Hurricane, we actually asked if there were 10 different sort of neighborhood areas, and that city asked us to ask exactly which neighborhood do you live in, and then we were able to break this down by neighborhood specifically. So, in Moab, 2/3 folks lived in Moab City, with most of the rest from Spanish Valley. So we can only sort of split the data that way. Whereas in Hurricane, we have the capacity to be pretty specific about well-being, comparing some different specific neighborhoods. So we have the capacity to do that. We really depend on the city partners to give us that kind of question to add so that we can have that specificity. We don't geolocate the respondents themselves any closer than a zip code.
Great. Thanks so much, Courtney.